NATO countries have announced they're ramping up production of ammunition. The move comes days after the military's alliance Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said Ukraine was going through ammunition at a faster rate than could be produced. The U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, meanwhile, says Ukraine has a chance of making a real difference on the battlefield. Take a listen.
For every system that we provide, we're going to train troops on that system, but we're also going to give them additional training on maneuver, on the integration of fires, on sustainment, and on maintenance. And so with that additional capability, better trained troops, platforms that can perform a lot better in this environment, I think they'll have a real good chance at making a pretty significant difference on the battlefield and establishing the initiative and being able to exploit that initiative going forward.
We can now bring in Dr. Gavin Hall, teaching fellow in political science and international security at the University of Strathclyde. Good evening. Thank you very much for joining us here on France 24. You heard there from the U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin that he's confident Ukraine has what it takes to win this war. He's so confident that Ukraine doesn't need jets. Is that a fair assessment?
Oh, good evening, and thank you for the invitation. I think that might be overstating Ukraine's actual ability there, because let's not forget we've had a period of a lull in the fighting over the winter months, which Ukraine obviously made gains in towards the latter half. It's clear Russia's preparing for a renewed offensive, quite possibly on the anniversary of the conflict next week. Certainly the supply of artillery munitions is something that's useful. But I do note that a number of officials have pointed out a rise in assault aircraft and attack helicopters that could potentially be used in an offensive. So the role of air power is something that could very well be important in this next phase of the conflict.
Because we have Western states that continue to say they will support Ukraine for as long as it takes. But how long is as long as it takes? And isn't it worrying when NATO's Secretary General says Ukraine is going through ammunition at a faster rate than can be produced?
In a way, it is alarming, but in a way, it's also not, and that shouldn't be overstated. What he's primarily referring to there is the NATO member states have a series of stockpiles, and those stockpiles are being used up. If the fighting is can continue at a certain intensity for a very prolonged period without any increase in production, then there might be an issue, not necessarily for Ukraine, but in terms of NATO as alliance to meet its core collective defence provisions, things such as the enhanced forward presence in the Eastern European countries.
Red lines NATO states weren't willing to cross a year ago. They seem to have crossed. Is the next thing on the agenda fighter jets?
Possibly, but all the supplies that are being given to Ukraine are given on the basis of individual member states. Okay, they happen to be member states of NATO, but it's not NATO coordinating this as a NATO effort, something which they've been very careful to do and maintain throughout, because they don't want to fit into Vladimir Putin's narrative of Ukraine being a NATO versus Russia war. It's a Ukraine aided by members of NATO with munitions.
But it's fair to say it's a proxy war, isn't it?
That is certainly an interpretation. It's probably not too far from the truth. And what is certainly noticeable from Stoltenberg's statement yesterday at the Defence Ministers' Conference is the language seems to have shifted more to what NATO can do. And that may indicate a greater degree of NATO coordination in who's supplying what and when. Particularly relevant with things like artillery shells and integrating different types of equipment together into a unified command and control, which is incredibly problematic, given the different countries supplying different weapons and armory.
Because let's talk about, for instance, if countries were to supply jets, because yesterday the U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin seemed to reject accusations that the U.S. was blocking Poland from sending its jets to Ukraine. Washington clearly has said they're not going to send jets, so that's the red line they've established for them. But he seemed to suggest that the U.S. wasn't standing in Poland's way. Is that a fair assessment?
Possibly, but I think the whole fighter jets issue is obviously something that attracts attention, but that's a little bit further down the line. What's being done immediately and now, and where there may be further movement in the short term, is air defence systems. And I note that both France and Italy have pledged and are going to be delivering air defence systems, and those are much more likely to be occurring in the short term. With fighter jets, you've got to have the fuel, the ammunition, the training, and everything that goes with them to be able to support that infrastructure. And whether that's present or will be anytime soon in Ukraine is a lot more open to question.
Western assessments state that Russia is, in fact, getting convicts to fight on the front lines. We know that the Wagner Group is actively involved in the fight around Bakhmut, for instance. At one point, there's going to need... Would you say what is happening right now on the battlefield is a stalemate where each side sort of make these small little advances? Is that accurate?
Yes, that would be accurate, certainly over this winter period. Obviously, we're expecting a renewed Russian advance.
Apparently, that's already underway, according to NATO.
Apparently. Or certainly like provisional elements of it, certainly troop mobilizations and positionings going on, which indicates that this will be a push into the southern regions through Donetsk and through up from Melitopol, possibly Kherson. But how this will all play out and what actually happens is going to be to be seen.
But can we just for argument's sake look into the future for a second? And I know the Ukrainians say they want Russian forces out of their territory, including Crimea, to sit down at the negotiating table. For you, what seems the likeliest scenario?
Essentially, pretty much any peace deal or negotiated settlement at the end of a conflict occurs when both sides are happy that their relative positions are effectively equal. It's what's known as a mutually hurting stalemate, whereby both sides view the cost of a prolonged conflict is going to be have a net negative benefit.
But Dr. Hale, Ukraine is not saying that the time has come because it's getting its support from the West. At one point, if that support were to stop, for instance, if the supplies of ammunition were not coming through, Ukraine would be in a different situation than it is now.
That is correct, and then the balance would change. But then there'd be no, if that situation was to occur and Russia was to gain the upper hand, then there'd be no need for Russia to be engaged in peace negotiations. They'd be trying to push forward to Kiev. In terms of probably what would be the most likely scenario if there was to be a negotiated settlement in, say, the next 2 months, that would almost certainly involve Ukraine having to cede Crimea, and I'm not certain that that's something they'd be prepared to do.
Dr. Gavin Hall, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us on the program tonight.
Thank you. Good night.